Okay, so welcome back. We have been talking about all of these climatic changes that occurred during the Pleistocene and these cycles of glacier expansion and retreat. Let's now sort of turn direction here and look at some of the biogeographic responses that took place in response to some of these changes that we just talked about. So, just to sort of put this in context, yeah, there were lots of changes to the climate, and what did this mean for certain habitats? So there were changes in the location, extent, and sort of the makeup or configuration of prime habitats for many species. There were obviously changes to climatic and broad-scale environmental zones, and some of this resulted in the formation and dissolution of dispersal routes, and that was probably well, definitely cyclical as well. So dispersal routes may have formed and then disappeared over time, and maybe multiple times while these glaciers were retreating and expanding, and the temperature was decreasing and expanding, and sea level was fluctuating. So some of the biotic responses, I mean, you can sort of categorize these into three um, different sort of groups. So some species moved with their optimal habitats. So they, as the climate changed, they moved to areas that were more suitable. Some species didn't move. They remained where they were and they adapted to the new conditions. And some species remained where they were, but they didn't adapt as well. So ultimately, they were reduced in their range or extent, and some ultimately went extinct. So it was usually one of these three things that were the biotic responses. If we look at some specific areas, so here we're looking at the western coast of the United States, we can see some of the changes. So here we're looking at shifts in February sea surface temperature along the Pacific coast and how the sort of marine biotic ecoregions or provinces change in response. So during the Pleistocene, most of these sea surface temperatures were cooler, and that's what you're seeing. So up here it was, -4 degrees cooler. On average, here was -2 degrees, and then as you go further south, the temperature, not much of a change here, and here it's a little bit cooler. And you can see the changes in response in these provinces. And a province is sort of like a smaller biome, like an ecoregion. Um, During the Pleistocene, you had this huge swath of cool temperate up here, and then a small little segment of just temperate, and then warm temperate, and most of this was subtropical. During modern times, like now, there's a large tropical region, a little bit of reduced subtropical, a little bit of expanded warm temperate, and massively expanded temperate environment, along with a reduction in the cool temperate. So this is Pleistocene on the left, and this is modern times on the right. And you can see that shift where cool temperate is sort of restricted to just the Pacific Northwest now. In the eastern United States, some other shifts were going on. So if we look at 20,000 years ago, one of the big things you see is that there's this huge swath of boreal forest that's basically spruce and spruce pine over a huge portion of the eastern United States, and then just boreal, even in this sort of wedge here, coming up along maybe sort of the Mississippi region here and up into pretty high latitudes. So different sort of environment. If you fast forward to sort of getting to the present, still a little bit in the past here, but more similar to what we have now, you're seeing basically a shift to a cool, temperate, deciduous forest, which is essentially what we have now. Like now we have a primarily deciduous, eastern deciduous forest over most of eastern North America, and the boreal forest is restricted to being up here. So some big changes there. There were also elevational shifts. So here we're looking at some of those elevational shifts in the eastern cordillera of the northern Andes in Colombia following the last glacial maximum. And basically, if we look during the last glacial maximum, you have this sort of environment where you have this gradient, and we've seen this, these gradients that form along elevational gradients where you have, a tundra-like environment and then sort of transitioning into more boreal like forest, and then more of a temperate forest, and then tropical and savanna like down here. What happened was this was the extent of those areas during the last glacial maximum. During the present, all of that has pretty much shifted um, upwards. And some of these, South America has some different types of environments. So while it's similar as far as elevational gradients, you can sort of see the transition working your way down in elevation here. Similar sort of environments, but a little bit different in South America than what we have in North America. The analyses, so a lot of this is done using sort of reconstructions using pollen samples. And so one thing you can see is in these reconstructions is sort of the reduction in area that was perennial snow from the last glacial maximum. Again, we're in the Andes here, from the last glacial maximum to the present. And you can also see on this figure here, it's a little bit easier to see. If we work back in time, we can see a decrease in the area that's associated with the Andean forest and sub-Andean forest. So this area and this area, if we go back in time, you see this decrease in that area. Here we're seeing the glacial recession. The glacial recession resulted in the expansion of forests at the expense of open canopy habitats. So again, we're seeing sort of an expansion of forest area going from the past to the present. So in Australia, you had most of this was partially forested. You see an increase in the expansion of forested area, and as well, similar sort of things happening in New Zealand and Australia. You see this increase in the area that is forested compared to grassland and shrubland areas. There was also an expansion of the geographic ranges of trees and other plants that usually lagged far behind the onset of interglacial conditions. White spruce is an example of this that experienced this northward range expansion during the retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet, and it was influenced by the prevailing winds. And so these prevailing winds were able to push this species, basically helping with the dispersal of the seeds that coincided with the Laurentide ice sheet, but it tended to be a pretty slow migration that lagged. It wasn't like the Laurentide ice sheet retreated and then immediately it moved in. It lagged pretty slowly behind this. Similarly, the range expansion of some inland lodgepole pine species has also lagged behind the retreat of the North American glaciers. So here you're seeing the timeline for which those species have been expanding and where they're kind of currently at. And there you can see they're still not occupying some of the montane areas. So there's like this suitable habitat up here that they still have not expanded to, even though those glaciers have retreated and that habitat has opened up. So here we're looking at, getting into some mammals. Once you get into species that can actually move around, things get a little bit more complex. So the geographic range shifts in 4 rodent species during the Holocene, sort of following the Pleistocene, indicates that there were some different responses in association to these habitats moving. So these dots are indicating the location of Pleistocene fossils, and then the shaded area shows the habitat, the current sort of range, geographic range of these species of rodents. So the collared lemming and brown lemming and the eastern chipmunk and the northern pocket gopher. You can see what something that's interesting is that, so yes, in the collared lemming, like once the glaciers retreated, they had a northward expansion, and something similar in the brown lemming. But when you look at the eastern chipmunk and the northern pocket gopher, different sort of range shifts. Like it's not just northward, and even with the pocket gopher, it's pretty much just straight west. And so, you would normally associate this retreat of the glaciers and a northward expansion into those areas by mammals that can move around. It tends to be more complex than that. Some species show some species that once co-occurred actually now have non-overlapping geographic ranges. So these dots indicate areas that all of these species in each of these maps were known to have co-occurred, and the colored is the range of where they're located now. So you can see basically in the past, all of these species were existing together, but now currently can have much different geographic ranges. And these are for all sorts of different types of mammals here. Basically, we're just looking at small mammals, but similar sort of trends where here the smoky shrew and the collared lemming and the ground squirrel and the Arctic lemming all coincided in this location where this dot was. Now they have vastly different geographic ranges, and same for these species and these species and these species. So not all species, even if they're similar types of mammals, are going to experience the same sort of range shifts in response to large scale changes like a massive glacier that has retreated. And this sort of summarizes some of that. So this is quantitative analysis of range shifts of North American mammals following glacial advancement and recession. So when glaciers advance, you would normally expect there to be just a southward movement, right? Like the glaciers are advancing, and so organisms are sort of moving away from that because they have less habitat in those areas. But it's not really the case. In fact, there's movement in all sorts of directions, so that the direction some organisms move north and northeast and northwest and all sorts of directions, and similar in glacial recessions, you would think there'd be a northward movement to go back to those areas that are opening up, but that's also not necessarily the case in every single one of these. There's all sorts of different movements in response to this, and part of this is the fact that just because the glaciers are retreating doesn't mean that climate is becoming favorable in all of those areas. In fact, there's all sorts of microclimate changes that are happening in response to that. So that's a little bit of what we're seeing there. Vegetation zones in the mountainous region of the American Southwest shifted up in elevation after the Pleistocene, and the region as a whole shifted from grassland to mixed woods to desert and grassland. So things shifted up in elevation, which we've just seen that a little bit and kind of familiar with that process. But overall, there was a shift from grassland and mixed woods dominated during the Pleistocene to mostly desert dominated and a little bit of grassland, looking at this area of the Southwest in North America. Also, coral reefs were substantially reduced during past glacial periods due to reduced shelf habitat. So here you can see globally how reduced the Pleistocene reef growth was compared to sort of the marginal belt of where it's at right now. Pretty substantially reduced, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that the continental shelf habitat that these rely on was substantially reduced. This is, the extent of continental shelf habitat now. We're in an interglacial period compared to the last glacial maximum, much less intercontinental shelf habitat. So that corresponded to a decrease, or at least less reef growth now, or sorry, in the past than there is now. So there's been an increase in reef growth now compared to in the past. Okay, so I'm gonna end this video. Keep working your way through the module. There's a reading that goes into a little bit more about that boreal forest and some of the dynamics of how it moved in response to shifts in the glacial extent. So keep working your way through this, and I'll see you in the next video.